students here, you know, are a new assistant. I know Claire's a new assistant professor. Look where Sandra is all these many years later. So we have great things in store for you as you go on. I missed that. So they'll talk to her about being a dean, I guess, with administration. When I was writing about Knight, I was writing about a bigger project, my dissertation at the time, about the revival of laissez-faire, and when it was going backwards, and in the process of going backwards, I found out about Henry Simons. And I have found him a curious and fascinating individual ever since then. Stefan was saying to me, or he has written about Henry Simons, and he says, I don't think he's interventionist, so realized I needed to put this in quotation marks because it's what Coase said about him. And so it's been, why is he interventionist? What I'm there we go, going the wrong direction. So this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. What's the big idea, as my one of our education professors says at Maryville, and a little bit about his early years, what's going on in 33 and 34, what I think are the elements of his interventionism, and go from there. All right, so he writes the Positive Program in 1934, and he says, eliminate monopoly, more definite rules of the game, eliminate tariffs. Sounds a lot like what you're associated with the Chicago School. But then, when I get into it further, he wants to eliminate monopoly either by public ownership or making the Federal Trade Commission the most powerful government agency and going to cap market share at 5%. The monetary rule was to stabilize the price level rather than the ones that we hear later, rather than the quantity of money, and then he wanted to have 100% reserves. He was very concerned about the distribution of income, wanted to have very much progressive income taxes and inheritance taxes to make sure that we're equalizing income, and he wanted to tax advertising. So this is not a Chicago economist. So over time, then people start wondering what's going on. Early explanations in 1967, Milton Friedman says that the reason Simons used this more discretionary rule of stabilizing the price level was he didn't really understand the contemporary monetary data. But in fact, he had reviewed Lachlan Curry's The Supply and Control of Money in the United States that had detailed data about the monetary aggregate. So he had read something about that. Then in 1962, in Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman also says that Simons was writing in a time when the federal government was smaller. So he was willing to have government activities that today's liberals would not now accept because the government has not been so overgrown, or has become so overgrown. Of course, then this is at this famous Law and Economics symposium in 1983. This is when Coase says, well, he's really highly interventionist. What's going on about that? And so then Friedman agreed, yes, you're right, but we need to think about this in terms of historical context. And by comparison with almost everyone else, he was very free market oriented at the time. By 1990, DeLong tries to rescue him or resurrect him as a classical liberal, and he just says that Simons didn't know subsequent theoretical developments, and he would have changed his mind if he knew what was going on, if he had known what Demets and Stigler and Coase had done further. And then more recently, Rob Van Horn and Morawski have really refocused the discussion and just basically have said how the members of the post-1946 Chicago School converted this classical liberalism of Simons to neoliberalism. which had some, as they say, which had some prospect of changing the socialist doctrines which were in ascendancy during this time period. Go the right way. This is why PowerPoint could be distracting, because I can't do that. I'm not used to this equipment. My argument, and it really has been what we've been talking about the last few days, is that he's really practicing the art as opposed to the science. And so that he is working as an economist from an earlier era, individuals who judged monopoly power and social change in a different way and practice using a different set of best practices. Part of the context set this in is Dorothy Ross's book in 1991. She characterized progressive social science, which was at the turn of the century. Imagine we'll hear some more about this from Tim. Concerned with the concentration of economic wealth and power, and the inequality that it engenders. Of course, there's a new political context, and this is sort of how we're getting back to our discussion of expertise and what role do economists play in that. And they change the role to become objective advocates. And then finally, there's an organic conception of social change. All right, I'll tell you a little bit about Simons. He's born in 1899. He went to the University of Michigan from 1916 to 1920. His family wanted to send him to East to school. His sister had actually gone to Wellesley, but they ran out of money. So he went to the University of Michigan, and at that point he said he was very much influenced by Fred Taylor, who had a very a textbook that was used by a lot of people. 1921, he moves to, after he's graduated, he moves to the University of Iowa, where he becomes a student of Frank Knight. And he's...
So he's not a Chicago economist, he's an Iowa economist.
He's an Iowa! Well, except for he didn't get his degree from Iowa, but he spent time. He was in Hawkeye blood for a while. So
I think next year we should have a day on Iowa.
Yes.
And then when Knight goes to Chicago, he moves to Chicago. Now he goes to Columbia and takes some classes. He also comes to Chicago to take some classes. In 1928, I believe he goes to Germany to do some more work on his personal income taxation. That's what's going to be his thesis. He never graduates. I don't really know that, but he never did earn his PhD. And he really didn't do too much during this time. He wrote one article on taxes, a couple of book reviews. He went out and gave talks to people in Iowa City, the Weatherly Group, if you know about them. But he really wasn't doing anything that much teaching, but he didn't do much. And then all of a sudden, in 1933 and 1934, he does all of these things. The syllabus material for economics, I think, becomes important for people who write about price theory in Chicago. Does 2 book reviews. He's writing these memoranda about making advocation for 100% reserves. He's working with the Senate trying to get a bill passed, and then this all culminates with the positive program for laissez-faire in 1934. So we have this person who's not doing that much, and then all of a sudden he's got this frenzied activity. So this is Sandra and David have always intrigued me with their cartoons. And this is a cartoon that I do not know for sure, but I think Simons would have seen. It was published in 1934 in the Chicago Tribune by Carrie Orr. And up at the very top, we see planned economy or planned destruction. And then we've got Wallace out there doing money. We're depleting the resources of the soundest government in the world. Young pinkies from Columbia and Harvard are out there swilling their power. There's Tugwell at the head of all of this. He's driving them. And the plan for action in the United States is spend, 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 and it's under the guise of recovery, bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, jump the Constitution and declare a dictatorship. Now this is, you know, isn't that great?
What's Stalin saying in the background there?
How red the sunrise is getting.
Observe that the communist is Trotsky.
That's right.
Oh yeah, and then it says over here, it worked in Russia.
That's the cover of your next book.
And it is out there in the public, you know. I don't have to, but anyways. So this sort of says it all in some way.
How much about Casey Orr and the Chicago Tribune this time?
Since I found this, I've been reading a little bit more. They are, I mean, he is known as somebody who always is attacking FDR through his political cartoons throughout there, but maybe you can tell us more. No, but he is known, and after I found this, I want to, there's nothing in the correspondence that he had anything to talk with him, but he does, Simons does correspond with people at the Tribune, so, but that's something that I want to.
Did the Tribune endorse FDR in 32? Or?
No, they didn't, no. So, and this is only just one person, but there becomes a great debate about what is going to be the nature of liberalism in the future, and this is something that Alan Brinkley said. He talks about, at the time, you have a lot of different ways of thinking about liberalism at that time. Here's this laissez-faire. And he characterizes it as somewhat, this is sort of an ideal, but in the early, but this is not working out the way they had hoped, because they haven't, the existing patterns of wealth and privilege have been protected. And so then we start to have a reform liberalism, which starts talking about this interconnectedness of society and that need to protect individuals and notice communities and the government itself from the excess of corporate power. And then the need to ensure, you know, the citizen, this egalitarian thing that comes from Simons. And then Otis Graham and Brinkley, and then there's a guy named Best, who have often talked about that during the Depression there becomes this debate during the New Deal between the collectivists and the anti-monopolists during this time period. So this is part of the context. We've got these cartoons as sort of depicting that, and then there is this anti-collectivist and anti-monopolist going on. All right, now this gets to what we've been talking about in terms of the art of economics, and Simons is clear that the economist is supposed to solve problems. He has this in this 1933 review of Beard. As he says, he invites us to contemplate a mongrel system of democratic government, private monopoly, and public control of relative prices and relative wages. This has been tried laterally in Germany, and it was just the kind of system that gave rise to the wealth of nations. And when he writes the positive program, he sort of continues with that idea. He's very concerned with the chaos of political thought that is underlying the New Deal. Because this is a Hayek section, I actually have included some of his correspondence with Hayek in 1934. And he had sent the positive program to a lot of people, but Hayek sent this back to him. And he does say, when he talks about his influences, that Frank Knight's influence starts to wane, and I think this is part of what it is. He said, you know, if it's too drastic, let me explain that the religion of freedom and intellectual interests along liberal lines seem deader here than in England. One must struggle as hard with friends as with enemies. The competent people are mainly like Frank Knight, ready to abandon all their hope and faith and to occupy themselves largely with explanations of why the deluge is both imminent and inevitable. So that part of it, he is really responding to this chaos of political thought. And he, as an economist, his job is to answer these problems. The other part of the task is that the economist, and this gets to what his notion of what an expert is supposed to do, is to serve as an objective advocate. And he has a professional and a moral responsibility to do this. It's professionally, but it's also morally. And the way to do this is that he is supposed to influence his fellow experts based on the analysis of current problems. And as he said, he directed what he calls his frankly propagandist track to the hope of providing a consensus of opinion. I mean, this notion of persuasion that we've been talking within a group which might do something to help in this situation. All right, and here is, he echoes these ideas in his correspondence with Hayek. I thank you deeply for your letter and for reviving in me the notion that discussion among economists has not become completely impossible. You thus have the rare and I also think scarce distinction of having read and understandingly and reported faithfully my assistance, your critical reactions. Hayek did not like the 100% reserves, for example. And if others of us were occasionally so scrupulous and interested in substituting discussion for debate, economics might sometime amount to something. And so if you read it, I mean, there's several, it's like a 3-page letter where he talks about several things. He gets upset about the having national ownership is another thing that Hayek objects to. But he feels like he's listened to and that they're having a discussion. And so that. All right, then in terms, the elements of his interventionism are the ideas. Some of this I attribute to two things. Classical liberalism is, once you put it in an organic society, it enlarges the possible role of government. And then when he is making his suggestion, he observes the real economy and it called for new interpretations of the neoclassical theory that he learned from Taylor. All right, here we get the phrase that we hear a lot from people associated with Chicago. In 1945, he writes what becomes his political credo, and it's the first part of his book, the posthumously published book of all his collected writings. And he talks about the relatively absolute standards for conduct, and these are things that were freedom to associate and disassociate, but equally important is the equality of opportunity to compete. And he also in this describes society as a living functioning organism or organizational organism that changes over time. So it's not little individual bits, but it's a society that changes over. It's an organism. Here are his qualities of what he talks of classical liberalism, liberty, commutative justice, equality, and a monopoly of violence given to the central government. And then when he goes to his theory, this is how he explains the Depression, the big problem he's trying to address. And he puts this in hierarchical order. Lots of times we always hear about money being his big thing, but he always emphasizes that it's the relative inflexibility of prices. So he's concerned about the concentration of economic power primarily, and then the next step of this is the contraction, what's happening in the monetary sector. And when he talks about inflexible prices, he goes in this long discussion about what how technology had initially created economies of scale, so we wanted to have bigger production units, but then the system had evolved, so we were having diseconomies of scale, so that we're having all these bigger organizations together that weren't providing productive efficiency, but we're doing things like getting together and using money for advertising. And then he talked also about how power is treated in the courts. He was very upset about the NRA, which was basically a collectivist plan, and it sort of comes from Truman's idea of associations, where it was going to be all right for everybody to get together, all the industries and plan. But not Truman, Hoover, thank you. Hoover. Yeah, Truman's still in Missouri at the time. Hoover.
Still selling hats.
Yeah, still selling hats in Missouri. And then this happens with Tugwell, where they have the NRA, and basically they're trying to have a planned economy about that. You know, they're allowing everybody to get together and set prices and all that kind of stuff. And he thinks that, and he uses what is a cartel model, what he calls is a cartel model, where he looks at industries, which ultimately you can see in 1947, Patinkin wrote about this in a book, and he says it comes from his notes of studying with Simons. But there becomes gross wastage of investment and because of excess capacity, and then there are all these incentives to advertise. So that's why we want to break up corporations, and that's why we want to tax advertising. And the same thing is happening with the craft unions that are allowing, they are organizing at the expense of the unorganized. So a certain group is getting power and other groups are not. And then his quantity theory of money is what he uses, but what he says is the problem is that there's been a contraction in both the volume and the velocity of effective money. And part of this is inflexible prices that do not let the price level to adjust to get everything to work. And then he goes into descriptions of what the banks are able to do and the financial institutions are able to do to make the velocity start to contract. So we're not having a stable velocity issue in later Chicago economists. So banks can create substitute monies, the fractional reserve system, and there was a focus on short-term investments that meant everybody could sell things in a hurry, and so we would have chaotic liquidation. So these were the reasons why we start to see the money supply shrink, and why he wants to have the fractional reserves of 100% reserves, because that's going to stop that from happening. Why intuitively, I keep wanting to put this the wrong way, this mouse. So by 1936, it's David's fault, sorry. By 1936, 1935, we have the NRA is declared unconstitutional. Tugwell's gone. A lot of these collectivists that he's really concerned about are no longer have the power in government that they had in terms of influencing this debate. You have Thurman Arnold at the Division of Antitrust, and he is engaged in all these antitrust trials. For some weird reason, my library at Maryville College has all the records of all of these hearings, and it's huge shelves of books. So there's all this investigation of market, the whole collectivism and monopoly power. But in 1937, so things might be looking better, but he gives a speech, and he still, at this point, says a modern program of laissez-faire cannot be a do-nothing program by any means. He said, I have a low opinion of governments, and the government's best, which government's least, and it contains much truth to be discarded outright. But the scheme for policy for which I plead may be called laissez-faire for historical reasons. Yeah, hysterical. But it cannot be a do-nothing program. So even as things are moving, maybe the cartoon is not quite as true as it was. So why is he still holding this position when there are all these changes here? And I still think I once again located in this whole notion of what we've been talking about is the art and what is the role of the expert, and that is, it's my professional and moral responsibility to solve problems and to serve as an objective advocate in this big discussion about them. Now, he does say in a letter to Hayek that, I confess, the nationalization of the industries, I might have been using that as a bargaining device. I'll give that to you so that I can talk about all these other things. So there is some room for Hayek and I to discuss this, and so we can talk about that. But then in the late 1930s, that speech, he starts, he continues to speak to people outside of the academy that he thinks might listen to him. He always was out giving speeches to people. He was writing in Fortune and Time. He also was taking positions that were very unpopular. Some reflections on syndicalism, he wrote that in 1944, and he was very anti-union, and he got in a lot of trouble. His promotion was delayed. His dean was really upset with him. People were always having to defend him. So even though this would be hurting him personally, he went ahead and did this. And of course, as many of us know, he wrote this proposal for the Institute of Political Economy that Hayek eventually carries forward and becomes the Monpellerin Society. And then the other reason why I think he's interventionist is because of his notion of this organic social development. And he calls this planning to sustain freedom. So rather than planning the economy, we have to plan to sustain freedom. And that is because existing economic and institutional conditions have changed. So, my conclusion is, why was he so interventionist? I looked at this in terms of how the discussion about Simons changed within the Chicago school. When he died in 1946, he left this galvanizing blueprint for saving classical liberal state that has both policy recommendations and ways to garner the public opinion necessary to put them to action. But I think his recommendations were very uncomfortable for his followers. The Chicago Economist should not be elevating the Division of Antitrust or the Federal Trade Commission to such an important place. So they had a dilemma. Or what are we going to do with this guy? Because we really, we like his, a lot of what he has said. And I think in the early years, before the Chicago school had the prominence, in the 50s and the 60s, they explained away these interventionist elements by appealing to his lack of knowledge about what was going on, his unawareness of what was going to happen later, and the interventionist time of the 1930s. But then as they began to gain influence after the failure of Keynesian economists to be able to help with stagflation, it was that they start to give up rescuing his classical liberal reputation. And in 1983, they can have this discussion about them. And it's not unexpected to me that Van Horn and Morawski, and I think Stefan's paper, I've read part of it, I think he says some of this same thing, that the classical liberalism Simons used in the neoliberalism post-Chicago school really diverge in what they think should be the presence of monopoly power. But I think Simons is really, like many people of his era, are really concerned about power and the private power, because it diminishes diminishes equality, and it diminishes people to participate in the conversation about where we should have the economy go and where we should have society, and they can't participate meaningful in that. So, but then the irony, so I think that that's what happens. I think that Simons is different, an economist from a different era, and he has different values, and he would be practicing art, and he really cared about rhetoric and discussion. I think that the irony, or what I call his curious legacy, is that Friedman is one of the more successful advocates out there in the public in the second half of the 20th century. That he took Friedman, and you know, I've always thought that that was part of the reason for the success of the Chicago School. They discussed internally, but then they were out there talking to the world. Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. He had a television show. He had these really wonderful debates with Galbraith about this, and they were very interesting. I teach my students research papers and how to make a scholarly debate, and we realized that they don't have visions. Our young people today don't get to, all they see is stuff on CNN and people yelling at each other. But back when I was coming up, we saw that kind of measured debate. So they rejected that, but they have employed with greater success his task to advocate, which I think that he learned from progressive social science during the pluralistic environment of the inner war economics, which would support also what Rob said, some of the things might happen. So I look forward to your questions.
I have Stefan first, but I'll come to you, Jordan. Got you next. Stefan.
Can I get the mic?
Tell me, I'm a little disorganized today.
It's car trouble.
It's car trouble.
Thank you. So since it was your paper on Simons which was accepted and not ours, I have to be critical, I guess. I just have to. I would like to make several points. First of all, you do not define the term interventionism and interventionist. So I was just asking myself, who is not interventionist in that period? Is Hayek also an interventionist in the 1930s, 1940s? When he says in the correspondence, I have a greatest sympathy for the general spirit of the positive program. So if Simons is an interventionist, would Hayek also be? Is Mises an interventionist when he's in his book of 1912 proposes a rule to limit fiduciary media? So is any intervention which is proposed an idea which leads you to become an interventionist? That I didn't quite get. You're talking about smaller government and larger government, and I think, as I read Simons and also the Freiburg School, to whom I think he is quite close, it's not about big government or small government. The question is which government. And it is about power, I agree with you, but the power issue doesn't make you an interventionist. I think it's just a different topos which leads you to different conclusions, but it's not about big or small, it's about what should government do, and it's about rules. So I think Simons and also the Freiburg School just see some interventions as necessary prerequisites for the market economy to function. So it's not intervening to correct results, but it's intervening, if we use the word, in order to make it happen. It's just the same what Hayek says in The Road to Serfdom is planning for competition. So again, the question, are all these people who call themselves neoliberals, are all of these people interventionists? I just think you need to distinguish between the two levels of analysis. The one is the theoretical level, all the talk about rules, and the other one is the practical level of economic policy. And as you were mentioning in your paper, Simons says in the one letter that the second level, the second of concrete policy analysis, can be tactical. It can be, let's say, approaching your opponents by making some concessions. But I believe that the upper level, the level of theoretical analysis, the talk about rules versus authority, is the central part for understanding him. So it's not about intervening in the sense that you want to correct results, but it's about intervening in order to set the framework within which laissez-faire can be, within which laissez-faire is valid. So it is about laissez-faire within rules. And just the last point, I think if you call Simons an interventionist, you should also call Buchanan an interventionist. Because I agree with you, it's not about free market liberalism as you put it in the paper, it's about constitutional liberalism. But then again, if Simons is, then so is Buchanan. Thank you.
Do you want to answer or do you want to answer?
I think, once again, the term interventionist comes from Coase, and I probably should be having it in quotation marks all the way through the paper. And that causes some of the confusion, because I think we do agree that Simons is advocating for planning the system, the rules ahead of time on how we should have the economy act in response to what's happening in the 1930s. So I think that we're in the same way in my use of Coase's term saying interventionist. It is interventionist to plan to sustain freedom at the beginning. And so the reason he is saying all these things in 1934 is because this is what we need to do in the economy the way it has evolved in 1934. So I think that the interventionist, I take your point that I think the interventionist gets messed up here because I am trying to respond to what Coase says and need to make it clear that this is intervening at the beginning to make sure that we have rules to deal with this power. I don't think my reading of later Chicago economists and this neoliberalism that is that there isn't this concern with concentrations of power that Henry Simons has, because there's this belief after they have done all their research that the concentration of power in the government is worse than the concentration of power in the economy in the 1930s. But in the 1930s, and I think that's part of this progressive element that Henry Simons still keeps carrying forward. And I think, I would speculate that he might still be concerned about that, but I don't know. I mean, he dies in 1946. But I think your point is well taken to make it that distinguish between those two things better.
I assert again that Knight and Simons were were Iowa economists, not Chicago economists so much. And to be completely serious about that, is your theme essentially that Simons and to some degree Knight too, and lots of other American economists were in this period peculiarly American, in the sense that they were using the intellectual resources of American progressivism, which was not a class analysis of our problems, as was commonplace on the left and the right. On the continent, especially, Britain is kind of an intermediate case. I think of and then the post-war version, quite post-war, say from the 1970s on, of neoliberalism is much more European. That there's a kind of confluence of the two lines. The analogy I have in mind is the history of American philosophy from a technical academic point of view, which develops in pragmatism its own way of its own in many ways characteristically American, optimistic, can-do interventionist, in the case of John Dewey, way of thinking about society, which then, in philosophy departments, is completely overwhelmed by the migration to the United States of European scholars. And then people like Samuelson and so on convert to continental style analytic philosophy in the 1930s and especially the 1940s. So, you know, these are two intellectual worlds, much more so than we're accustomed to thinking of them now. I mean, to take a look at this audience, it's completely international. But a conference of this sort in the 1930s would have had one person from the old world. So it is that a way of framing your theme?
Yeah, I really like the Iowa school connection.
As a kind of an emblem of this American, even Midwestern way of, well, we're kind of craggy individualists, but we're going to join for the barn building and we're going to get going here. We're going to do practical things. I mean, after all, at the state level, there was a lot of interventionism.
I mean, all these laboratories we experienced in Wisconsin, of course, we know about that.
And agricultural extension, the great land grants.
And in the 1920s, and you know, Frank Knight was very much involved in this, the whole notion about what should we do for social control. I mean, you know, that's there was also, after World War I in the United States, the Economist had first helped in some of the work in Washington, and I think there was some optimism about what was going to be happening in the United States. So that is my argue that Simons is really influenced by that, and that's where this comes from. So I like the Iowa idea.
So what I find helpful about this paper is the timing. You bring things back to the early 1930s. A lot of the more recent work there's been this big surge of work on neoliberalism and so on. Murawski and Van Horn are just one example of this, and they tend to take off from the Mont Pelerin Society, the later 1940s. So sometimes they go back to the quote Walter Lippmann. But it raises the issue of if you're going to put things in a sort of broader social context, sort of where's the demand coming from? And that's the issue that poses the question George Stewart always wanted to ask. He says economists' ideas really don't catch unless the larger society is wanting them. By putting it, in sort of immediate response to the FDR in the early 1930s, it just makes a lot more sense. Just sort of a logical explanation. So I think that's very useful. Just a couple of points, sort of a question and a point. I don't think you could, and I think prudentially you should be, I don't think you're completely fair to Brad DeLong. You're right that he says that there are these later developments that Simons wasn't aware of, but prudentially the reason why you should be, when I read your title, my first reaction was, didn't Brad DeLong answer that question? And before I read your paper, I went back and read DeLong's paper. And he does make those points, but his major drift is really sort of along the lines that Stefan was making, that what Simons was trying to do is define the rules under which competition should work. And that's why the sense in which he was interventionist. And then DeLong takes to task some of these later people like Friedman and Stigler for not being sufficiently sensitive to this. So I think you should say a bit more about DeLong and how what you're doing differentiates. And I think you do have something to add beyond that, because, again, that was my immediate reaction. And my sort of question, I would like to know more about Knight and Simons, because you suggest some parting of the ways. You said that Simons early on, in Iowa study, but I would like to know more about, and more generally, what was going on in the early 1930s that Simons was interacting with at that time. So I get more of a sense of, how that was emerging about the timing at this time. And Knight didn't apparently respond this way. There were others that maybe were. I don't know, but that's something I want to know more about.
Well, I don't know how much time I was going to have here, so I didn't. This is what Simons does say. These are the people. These were his influences, and so he talks about Taylor. And apparently Taylor was very famous for teaching people in economics.
Of course, everyone was Feiner. I don't think he got along too well with Feiner.
No. So he did this, and so this was his first, but then here we go to Simons. And then he says, and he writes this in a 1942 letter, this is going to be Fetter, where he says, Knight was nearly perfect influence at the next stage. And what I think is he really provided, he says that Frank Knight provided him this really multifaceted view about the debate in the 1920s. And I remember when I wrote this paper back in the, it was so hard to wrap your head around what Frank Knight was saying, because it seemed like to me that if somebody took a position, then it was incumbent upon him to take the opposite position. And I think that, and he was doing that a lot in the 1920s. He was exploring, issues of self-control, the ethics of competition. I mean, he's really looking at risk, uncertainty, and profit. I think Simons was influenced by Knight's idea about uncertainty, because that's part of the reason why you have to have this planning to sustain freedom, because the world is uncertain and you don't know how it's going to evolve. But I think he really, I think it's 1933, Knight got or 32, he got so despondent about the election of 32 that he wrote this paper about we need to vote for the communists. And at this session, Patinkin did come up to me after this session, and I was like, what's he going to say? What's he going to say? And what he said to me was, do you know about the paper? The communism, because it had not been published yet. And so, he said, you need to include this in here. This should be, and I think it was published a couple of years. I forgot how much. A few years later, they actually published it. But I think that Simons got really distressed with him being, throwing up his hands and not, just, as he said, just not wanting to do anything about it. And so then Simons talks about Fetter. He's also influenced by Frank Fetter. And what Simon says, he was an example, as you see, what a political economist should be in terms of broad political philosophy and professional ethics. And Fetter did write about social change and public opinion. He was, in 1931, he was in a committee of the American Economic Association where they sent some memoranda about what to do with monopolies, very upset about it. And then he wrote this book, The Masquerade of Monopoly. So I think he becomes disenchanted with Knight's ideas. So Knight always champions him. I mean, he's under attack by everybody because...
But Knight's Simons, he champions Simons.
He always champions Simons. He protects him. They wanted to get rid of him because, I think it was Viner that said, or Douglas, I can't remember which one, that positive program was a skillful piece of propaganda, but it's not good work.
Is relative absolute, is that Simons?
It's in his paper, but
Which paper?
It comes from Knight, doesn't it?
But I think it's from Knight, so he's quoting his teacher. So I mean, they have this relationship all the way, and Knight always, he moves to the law school in 39, and Knight is always there championing him. But it's, Simons does these things that, probably he's saying you shouldn't be doing this, but he's still got to do it because I sense because he feels like he needs to. It's his responsibility to do this, even if he gets himself in trouble.
Dan Hammond, Sherry, thanks for the memory that Don Patinkin was in the session, because I'd forgotten about that, and that was, I remember very well, probably the same thought you had. I can give a paper with someone like Don Patinkin in the audience and survive. I felt, okay, this is okay. I survived. On the corporate power monopoly, I take the subtext of Phil and Rob's work together to be that the New Chicago School and the free market study were really serving corporate interests. And so the question, I think, is really essential. The matter is really essential to the transition from old to new Chicago. And I think Warren Nutter's PhD dissertation may be crucial here. It was published by University of Chicago Press in 1951. And his dissertation was sponsored by the free market study, which of course Simons was to be the director of the free market study, and then he died and director became the director of the free market study. But in the some of the notes from the meetings preceding the free market study being set up, in the course of setting it up, the study was designed, my memory is this, the point of the study was to get empirical evidence, factual evidence on important questions like the extent of monopoly. So Nutter's dissertation was an empirical study of the extent of enterprise monopoly in the US. And my sense is that this was very important to the diminished concerns about private monopoly that's not supported by government that you find in the New Chicago. That plus George Stigler's studies that came when he was at Columbia and later in Chicago.
Yeah, I think I agree. I haven't seen this on checklist. Thank you. But I have the same sense that that's part of the reason there was this change because of the studies.
My question is about the relationship between government and the market, and where it is that people believe the source of power originates, and whether or not Simons or anyone else provided a mechanism to explain why they thought that that power originated in markets and then corrupted or influenced the state instead of the other way around, or whether they thought it was completely symbiotic, whether the origins matter, but whether there was a mechanism is my real question.
I think this gets back to what Deidre was saying, that this was in the environment at the time, that you were born in the United States, and maybe in the Midwest even more particular. Now, I never thought about being Midwestern. But then we see our cartoon where they're going after the Eastern establishment in the cartoon, and this was a Midwestern cartoon, that they're just, this is what you grow up hearing about, is corporate power, and corporate power is bad and takes advantage of people. So I think that that's an idea that is I can't say that word, peculiar to economics in America at that particular time.
Well, it's this American opposition to bigness.
Bigness, yes.
And it's just in our American DNA, and it's not in German DNA. It's not in French, for God's sakes, it's not in French.
Is there ever a careful working out of the mechanisms? Is there anything to push against?
Oh, and Simons there isn't. And no, he's just asserting that it's there and that we need to respond to it. I mean, if you think about bigness, you go back to Andrew Jackson.
Sure.
And he's from Tennessee, and we get rid of the Bank of the United States. And the story we tell, and I don't know if this is true, but this is the story we tell in Tennessee. At that time, every bank had its own currency. They had banknotes. And so we had these currency exchanges, which were supposed to say whether the banknotes were worthwhile or anything, or not worthwhile. And Andrew Jackson got involved in a transaction, and it turned out he took really bad banknotes. And so here he is out on the frontier, and the big banks are bad. So I just feel like it's part of the American experience to not like the bigness. And I don't think Simons, he just sort of said, he says, we have evolved, he calls it an enterprise economy. And so we need to rethink laissez-faire in the context of an enterprise economy. And there's a lot of people, because then remember the counter thing is people are saying, the collectivists are saying, hey, we can have this planned. We have these trade associations where they're all the business people are going to get together and they're going to plan output and prices and everything. And so it was allowed in the late 1920s in the Hoover administration. And then it becomes the law in 1932. I mean, with the passage of the NRA. And so he's sort of responding that this is not the way to deal with this bigness issue. So there's a debate about what to do with bigness, which I just think is peculiarly American.
Along that line, Sherry, I just wanted to underscore something Deirdre mentioned about pragmatism, because it does seem like that's part of the answer to your original question about why Simons was an interventionist, however that's defined. And also his idea of economics as practical problem solving. That impulse seems to me is pragmatic. I agree with Deirdre's suggestion about it being sort of Iowa, Midwestern American, but that's Chicago too. I mean that's the John Dewey Chicago. Sure. And that might be a thread you could pull out a little bit.
Thank you.
My name is Olga Farm, and I'd like to apologize for my nervousness. First of all, my intervention is rather a comment or a question, a rhetorical question. So competition is one area where economists disagree even to this day, and there's a complete divergence between what type of policy recommendations they make, and that is based on how they envision competition from competition theory. So the interventionists endorse the perfect competition model, and then all their policy recommendations are aimed so that the economic agents always equate marginal cost and marginal benefit, which is unrealistic, and that this seems where Simons seems to fall and seems to endorse the same. His idea of equality in competition is exactly anti-competitive, and this is opposed to those who view competition more monopolistic and rigorous as a process. So it seems to me that this is one area where there's no room for debate. And Simons, as you claim that he's open to discussion and he's practicing more art. But it seems that this is one area where there's no room for debate. And in discussions with Austrians like Hayek and Mises and Kirchner, who completely reject the perfect competition model, there wouldn't be an agreement towards intervention in case of monopoly. So I think that this is one area where they haven't interacted and discussed enough. So I tend to disagree that Simons was open to discussing the policy recommendations.
I think it does become a fundamental value for him to get rid of power. That's the issue, and he would be against power in government and power in organizations. And I think that that's a fundamental value that he holds. I guess, and the reason, and I guess why, he's trying to get these ideas out there so that that other economists can just come to some consensus so that they can take this out there to the world, which is ultimately what happened in the Chicago school. In the letter, he's, between Simons and Hayek, they clearly had points of disagreement, and they were trying to figure out, like Hayek said to him, I think you're wrong to to recommend nationalization of industries, and then so Simons did change his mind, something about that. I don't know if I'm answering what you're saying. There probably is a sense this is a fundamental value, and that does get to the problem when we're trying to have discussion. That there gets to be a point where we have to say this is what we really believe, and then you have to advocate for it. And so that's where am I getting to what you're trying to your question or not? Okay. Thank you.
Sherry, thanks for your paper. One of the things that struck me is that this is a nice chapter and a theme of this conference in the history of American economics, which is what should be the role of the state in economic life. And second, what is the role of expertise therein? That's really what you're trying to get at in some sense with respect to Simons. So I have 2 or 3 suggestions for trying to situate Simons in his intellectual antecedents, but also in the economic history of the time, which is obviously important. And 2 things struck me is that this idea of a positive program for laissez-faire, that idea is completely intact already in John Bates Clark. That's how I would describe his program being classical policy. It's up to the state to establish what laissez-faire once provided, but can no more. The other phrase that struck me is this idea of objective advocate. Mary Ferner spoke about the progressive era, objectivity and advocacy. This is a deep fundamental tension for the progressive economists, right? This if you're an objective economic scientist, you can't be an advocate because that undermines your scientific bona fides. But if you retreat too far into the ivory tower, you can't influence affairs. And this is the tension that runs, all the way from the progressive era through the New Deal, and maybe even beyond. It's a big theme in this what should be the role of the state in commercial life. So the 20s are, I don't know anything about Simons except what you've told me, but the 20s really turns out to be a crucial moment in this question of, what happens between the progressive era and the New Deal era. And American historians have spent a lot of time debating about whether those are different kinds of liberalism or not. So 2 quick suggestions. Trying to figure out, I guess this is Stefan's point, is trying to figure out exactly how interventionist Simons was. It might be helpful to look at some of the incredibly important events of the 30s. I noticed he was writing in 33, which is sort of the very bottom of the Depression. There's 25% unemployment in March. Pretty hard to argue laissez-faire in that environment, even if you're residing in Chicago. It'd be interesting to know what he thought about when FDR went off the gold standard, because that had very important implications for the money supply and for velocity, which you mentioned. The Social Security Act was passed in 35. Federal Labor Standards Act in 38, and then in 37 they tightened money and fiscal policy, and it led to a second double dip. So that his reaction to those economic as opposed to intellectual events might help situate him, how interventionist he was or was not. And the last point is this idea of power. I think this is. You're onto something here, and it may be that there's this kind of, he's more populist than progressive, being from the Midwest. So power, one worry is that it leads to plutocracy. Richard McCormick has a nice paper called The Discovery that Business Corrupts Politics. But the progressives were worried about power in the sense of it's bad for consumers, it's inefficient. And the populists were worried about power because it's bad for the small producers, not because it's bad for consumers. That's a tradition, as you say, that goes back to Jackson and maybe beyond. So it might be useful to sort out exactly what about power is objecting to, and that'll be easier to situate Simon's the right thing. Those are my comments.
I would say that, when he writes the positive program for laissez-faire, there's lots of people that respond to it. I just did what Hayek said because of the session this morning. But he is like the vanguard of trying to say, I'm going to try to support laissez-faire within this environment in 1933 when we're going in a totally different direction. So he is one of the first people that try to defend this position.
I just have a quick follow-up to this Hayek-Simons and the issue that Olga raised, because Hayek replied, Hayek had gotten a hold of this pamphlet in 1934, and I don't know that Hayek is all that famous then. Did I understand you to say that Simons had sent Hayek the pamphlet?
Yeah, I think he sent
And it raised the issue of why did Simons try to do that? Now, I'm not sure when Knight first contacted Hayek. It was sometime in the 30s, but why out of the blue apparently it was out of the blue, did Simons decide to send this to Hayek?
I think...
He was presumably sending this all over the place. But.
Yeah, I mean, he's, because he's trying to, gather public opinion together. So he sent it out to a lot of people. And I thought about that when I was doing this. Why did he send it to Hayek? I don't know.
Yeah, Hayek was very famous in economics in 1934.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Were there a bunch of other famous people that he was, circulating to this to?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think, Hayek and Knight have had their discussions by this time period. So Knight, could have told him to do that.
Because he went to LSE. Had Knight gone to LSE by that time?
I think.
That was in Economist in 1933.
Pass it down.
David, that's right.
Deirdre, do you want to just follow up on this? Go ahead.
Following up on this, I can't remember. It's simply, it is called a positive program, and we would be inclined to say, yes, positivism or positive economics. No, that's not what it is. It's positive as against Simons' complaints about how hopeless Knight is. And then the other figure who's hopeless, becomes hopeless, is the Schumpeter. Lots of people were hopeless in the 30s and 40s. They didn't think we were going to make it. Fascism was on the rise. Communism was on the rise. At the end of World War II, there were something like, 15 functioning democracies in the world.
I think it's just really interesting. One thing I worry about, not in your paper at all, but in the criticisms of Simons' positions that come out of the 60s and 70s. And I think some of those criticisms are conditioned upon a couple presuppositions. One presupposition is we don't have to worry much about near monies. Another presupposition is deposit insurance solves all problems freely. Oh, we've learned something. We've learned, when the housing stock gets monetized, and the papers talk about using your house as an ATM, think, oh, gee, that sounds like a near money to me. And then the sort of the question of whether, she and I have been talking about this in one of our things, is that can you really have only one insured money? Does that work? If you insure one, don't you sort of really have to insure all of them? Because if the money markets weren't insured until the run started, and then all of a sudden they became insured. But those empirical claims were commonplace in the 60s and 70s. And so the tradition called this empirical claim, empirical claims look back at Simon Says got wrong. Well, maybe he didn't get it wrong. Maybe he saw something that we didn't see, or we fooled ourselves into thinking there's a free deposit insurance corporation. And so I think that some of the rethinking of things like the 100% reserve is trying to recover some of this lost, picking up some of this discussion. And then just as a point of information, if you want to read the post-World War II discussion of 100% banking, which Mintz and Henry Fisher pick up, you're going to have to come visit us at George Mason. Okay. No, it's crazy, but all of that correspondence is in the Clark Warburton collection at George Mason, where we also have the institutional memory of the FDIC. That's not a joke. We do. I mean, this is the FDIC did a document dump, but instead of going to the National Archives, it came to George Mason. And so that, I don't remember any Simon's correspondence, but then again, I didn't look. But there's lots and lots of Irving Fisher correspondence, lots of with Warburton. And so that there's this, that you got to be really careful about, are these criticisms from the 60s and 70s, whatever, those theoretical conditions are just, he was assuming something like 2 + 2 = 5. Okay, no, that's probably not a good idea. But are they empirical things that you learned? Maybe he was closer to the truth than some of his critics were.
Thank you. I do think, Friedman's working on the quantity theories is very different than Simon's, and so that really echoes in what you were saying. In the 1960s when he was writing, it's a very, very different quantity theory, which was one of my first discoveries when I went back. Well, this isn't the same at all. The Fed can't control, can't control the supply of workers in a year and things. So I think you're right about that. And thanks for the idea about the papers. I have a grandson in Washington, D.C., so I might want to come to George Mason.
Absolutely.
For 2 reasons.
Sherry, I have a question for you and for anybody, because this came up actually at last year's AGS conference when I was responding to Stefan's paper, and it's a mystery to me. Simon lays out a positive program, which is not negative like Frank Knight, but also not do nothing laissez-faire. There's a role for government. In the late 30s and 40s, before Mont Pelerin, Hayek was contrasting his laissez-faire liberalism with do-nothing laissez-faire. And my question is, who is the benchmark? Who were the no-government, libertarian, laissez-faire folks who perhaps, I know Hayek was setting himself apart from, and perhaps Simon's was as well.
I don't know.
David kind of stand up.
Well, the person that it has pleased the profession to forget is Thomas Nixon Carver. That Carver is a flaming laissez-faire person and also a eugenicist. And of considerable stature, he's president of the American Economic Association, chairman of the Department of Party. And he was accused in the public press of being a Nazi for the extermination rhetoric. So that this is one, and he's really important in some libertarian founding moments. And so that there is a real, sort of the caricature of the laissez-faire eugenicist. There is actually one. And Ross's research volume is going to have a Carver issue, I think, and Ross is going to publish the large attack on Carver from Knight. And so that there's a little attack from which is in JSTOR. There's a little attack of night on Carver, but Ross is sitting on a massive attack. And so the question is, who is the, and so that there's a do-nothing, there's sort of a do-nothing kind of thing that's floating out there that's important that we just, for all sorts of good reasons, have decided to forget.
David, going back earlier, wasn't the Manchester School sort of part of it, sort of really?
He's speechless.
Yeah, and we've got the reformers. I mean, want to get rid of things, want to get rid of tariffs and that sort of stuff. So we've got to talk about. I've not worked on the Manchester School. I'm more comfortable working with individual people and that sort of stuff. And the Manchesterism is a label that it's convenient to apply and if you're talking about Bright, but that's a late, but Carver's important, I think, because he's an overnight visitor to the White House. He's got extensive correspondence with Hoover. And so if you're thinking of Hoover is the on the ground, this is the target, sort of Carver is very close to Hoover at a personal level. And you can just sort of walk through one of his disciples, what he's doing. He's in the textbook controversy. And then Carver's important for the Los Angeles libertarian movement.
I'm not disputing anything you're saying about the U.S. It's just I think there was this movement in England and the debate in England, which so was there. So you had sort of it's centered around sort of sets of things in the Manchester School that Sidgwick responded to, sort of in defining laissez-faire as something quite different than what sort of these people are saying laissez-faire. That's what I mean.
Well, but of course, in the larger, outside of economics, there were anarchists. There were lots of people who were saying zero government, it's a tool of the capitalists, overthrow it.
They were all deported now.
Yeah, or hung.
There are in the 30s, you're starting to see anarcho-capitalism arise. That Rose Walker Wayne is really an anarcho-capitalist, and so that there's that sort of stuff. It's a linking of anarchy and capitalism.
So it's earlier, actually.
Yeah.
It could go back to the 1880s.
Sure.
Great paper, Sherry. One of the things struck me, you were talking about, to summarize, that Simons wanted to plan so as to save freedom, or plan to save freedom. And that's sort of exactly, I think, what Keynes said in the concluding chapter of the General Theory. And aside from mentioning Keynesians of the 1970s, I don't think you addressed Keynes per se. And I'm wondering, it's kind of like similar to Tim's question. I mean, what was the connection between Simons and Keynes? Was there any correspondence? Did he come out publicly or write about Keynesian policies, theories?
There's no correspondence with Keynes, but he does review Hanson's book. After Hanson takes a more Keynesian stance, and he's not favorable of the, trying to have the demand management planning. So he does it later, not initially, but when he's writing the positive program, he's not. He doesn't talk about Keynes, and he does. But as Keynesian economics, as interpreted by Hanson, gets out there, he does not like the demand management ideas. So you can talk to Keynes.
Last comment?
Yeah,
Just very briefly on that. I found a card by Keynes in the Simons papers, which says that he thanks for a memorandum. So it might be that he sent in the 33 memorandum. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's thank Sherry first.